So we had the pleasure of getting together and shaking hands and having a beer and stuff in Ottawa earlier this week. We were both at the Conservative Hunting and Angling Caucus outdoor symposium and some meet and greets and stuff. So that was pretty awesome. What were your kind of thoughts about that event? It seems to be something that you're involved in a lot.
Yeah, it was great to get you to meet you in non 3-inch square on my computer screen form, as with a bunch of the folks who were there. So that was great. I unfortunately missed the first day, so I missed some of the content, but I was at last year's symposium as well. Looking forward to seeing this become an annual event, and watching the attendee list change and the conversation change, and hopefully give us more opportunities to meet folks from around the country, from across the country, who you may not otherwise cross paths with. I had some great conversations with the guys from Wild Sheep Society BC, who I probably would have never had any other reason to be in the same place at the same time as those folks. So, not to pick on them, but they're certainly probably the best example on completely the other end of the country from me here in Nova
Yeah.
Scotia.
Yeah, I mean, networking's good, and what I find valuable is it's keeping hunting and trapping and angling and the collective conservation issues, the conversations, always in these key venues. This happened to be Ottawa, Capitol Hill. It was a conservative partisan event, but they're still elected officials. And it's just a matter of just always being there to say, we are part of this too. The trapping community is part of the industry, and we're part of the conservation community. So it's kind of one of those, for you anyways, one of those places where you just always got to be and always ask a trapping question. So
Absolutely. Like I said to one of the organizers, that I showed up late and asked a question. It worked for me all through university. You get the attendance points as long as you ask a question. So
yeah,
it's certainly, like you say, it is a partisan event. It's hosted by members of parliament. For Institute of Canada is a non-partisan organization, but I'd just as happily show up to the Liberal Hunting and Angling Symposium or the NDP Hunting and Angling Symposium if they chose to do one. So it's certain, we have relationships on all sides of the political aisle. It just so happens that we got invited to this event by the Conservatives.
yep, yep. Now you were there prior to this for Seal Products Day. I would give a bit of a summary of what that's about.
Yeah, for sure. So spending a lot of time in Ottawa lately to end off the parliamentary calendar, but at the end of May, we were in Ottawa. We had a delegation of members from the Seals and Sealing Network to attend National Seal Products Day celebrations. So National Seal Products Day is an actual day created through an act of Parliament in 2017 that celebrates the importance of seal hunting, seal harvest, and seal products to coastal and remote, rural, and indigenous communities. So we had a crowd of us there, furriers and seal processors. We had the chief of Halibu First Nation, Jenny Brake, was with us as well, and we had a number of meetings around Parliament Hill, and there was a reception that evening with some amazing seal meat, prepared seal meat food from Pollen Nation chefs, Amanda and Nathan from Western Newfoundland, and gave us an opportunity to go and speak to MPs, speak to senators about, especially about the Senate Fisheries Committee's new committee report on seals, and the need for the government to take real meaningful action to support seal harvest, not only because of the economic benefits of harvesting seals, but also the impacts of seals on our commercial fisheries and endangered species and recreational fisheries species. So it was an encouraging couple of days with some really solid meetings. And like I said to the fisheries minister, I said, there's plenty of runway now. What we need to see is some real action. It's one thing to say great things, and it's one thing to add another committee report to the pile of committee reports that say we need to do something about seals. But now we need something to actually happen.
Right. I mean, that's pretty cool that something like the seal report comes out and then it just times with your seal products day. And as everybody knows, like you kind of bring food to a plate and people around with food and drink. It's something that brings people together. If we simply talk about trapping and the economics of it and stuff, those can be divisive. But food brings people together and breaks some barriers down. Even just like the seal products themselves, like to see things made from it has got to be a good like segue into some conversations about seal harvesting, seal management, and sustainability.
Yeah, we had one of the artists from our Proudly Indigenous Crafts and Design program, Talrumik, Christina King. She lives in Terrace, BC, but she's originally from Inuvik, Northwest Territories. She makes incredible stuff. Slippers and vests and accessories and jewelry using sealskin. And I had to control myself from putting down an offer on a pair of slippers that she had made that I've been eyeing when we made social media posts about them. I was like, those are really nice slippers, but there's no way they'll fit me. And that was my saving grace. So that I was talking to her about these slippers, and she was like, "Oh no, they're a size smaller than yours, but they'll stretch." And I was like, "I have to go. I have to leave. I have to walk away." We'll let somebody else. I have plenty of seal products already. Let someone else buy these slippers and become an evangelist for seal products with their new pair of slippers.
Oh, I might have to see the picture.
I can send you a link.
Okay, awesome. Is there anything else on the seal report that you kind of want to touch in on? Like, what was it? What were some of the main like takeaways
Yeah.
from it, and
So
where do we go from here with it?
Yeah, so the committee report has 9 recommendations in it, and folks can find the full Senate report if they'd like to read the whole thing on the Senate website, and we can probably throw a link in the show notes to it as well. The 9 recommendations, some of them are not particularly surprising, of the need to invest more in science around the impacts of seals on fisheries, the need to fight misinformation about seal harvesting, and put together a national campaign or an international campaign to fight misinformation, as well as the need to support marketing efforts to put more product in people's hands, in people's stomachs, and on people's backs, because that is the best way for us to destigmatize seal products. And interestingly, there was one very particular recommendation around the need for the government to take a look at the Income Tax Act and potentially take action to strip charitable status or non-profit status from organizations who regularly employ misinformation and disinformation around the seal hunt. So, there's a lot to unpack in that one recommendation, but certainly interesting to see once again that the conversation around seals and our bigger kind of society-wide conversations around misinformation and disinformation are kind of coming closer and closer together, and that we're really seeing, we've seen this recently in the Senate committee's study that they had misinformation and disinformation experts from across the country, and they had one session that was just about misinformation and disinformation, and how anti-sealing groups, anti-fur groups regularly employ these misinformation and disinformation techniques, and is that purely just because they're trying to advocate against seal hunting? They're just interested individuals who dislike seal hunting, or is there someone behind the scenes, a hostile state actor, or someone who's behind the scenes, not necessarily calling the shots, but amplifying some of these messages to try and serve their own geopolitical ends?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's one thing, like there's the whole freedom of speech issue. We've been seeing that across, Canada with that, and like the blackouts with American news being shared on social media sites in Canada, and all this kind of stuff. There's one thing for someone to come out and use their platforms or their organizations to say, we don't support trapping, we don't like the idea. Da, 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 da. And it's like, great, that's just a position, it's a value, it's a belief, which everybody has the right to communicate those things. But what you're saying is like, yes, but you can cross the line and come out and say, we don't like seal harvesting. And oh, by the way, Canada is still killing 1 million whitecoats every year. Look at how sign this petition. You can say that is factually false, and you're liable for saying things in the public discourse that are untrue. And then that's where it would kick in and potentially go after at least a Canadian organization that has registered charitable status with Revenue Canada for that.
Exactly.
Okay.
And there's a difference between, freedom of speech, which is the government not impeding your ability to express yourself, and government supporting that speech by giving you preferential tax treatment or otherwise.
Yeah.
So, it's an interesting debate to have, I think. I'd probably find myself to be more of a free speech absolutist than most, but it does kind of cross that barrier into, well, we're not really talking about free speech anymore. We're talking about government support for speech.
Yep.
So
yeah,
it's an interesting debate that I think will continue to play out, not only talking about seals or fur, but, in kind of broader conversations around charitable organizations.
Very, very interesting. We'll see where that one goes. Anything else on Senate report? That was your main recommendation. Yeah, I'll put a link. I'll put a link in the show notes if folks want to read the details, like we said. So I think the main thing is it's like, make yourself aware that that Senate report has been published, where it is, and wherever you are in this country, even if you're not part of the seal harvesting industry, take your opportunity to send an email to your MP and just say, hi, I'm Canadian, I'm from British Columbia, I do support the recommendations, and I want to know your action plan to implement these. Like, I think anybody that's outside the industry, if we all do that thing, like collectively our voice is heard, right? And making elected officials follow through and deliver on recommendations is, I don't know, probably one where we've fallen down in the past, where we get all excited and then we let them get away with not implementing report. So
exactly, we say these are great reports. Fur Institute of Canada applauds the release of the report, or Seals and Sealing Network applauds the release of the report. But it's then, we then have to hold these elected officials, or I mean in the Senate, these appointed officials, accountable as best as we can to say, well, you said this needs to get done. What have you done since to get it done?
Yep. No, absolutely. And even just raising, like, I could raise that issue with my MP here in British Columbia. We live in the Rocky Mountains, as disconnected you could get from the East Coast sealing industry. But I could be like, hey, there is a Senate report. I'm aware of it. I've read of it. Your party members are here on it. I want to make sure you're aware of it. And if you have the opportunity to support your colleagues in Ottawa, please do that. And I can do that as an individual.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. Jumping over to PEI, there was a petition that actually made its way to the elected officials about a snaring ban for licensed trappers. Which was actually turned down by the government. This is a super interesting story, so maybe fill folks in on
absolutely.
What you know about it. There's a bit of integrity here, actually, for somebody that was against it.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, this has played out over probably the last 7-8 months now. There was an unfortunate incident in PEI where a dog was killed by illegally set snares. and
On
that's
private property.
on private property. On PEI, you require landowner permission to set any kind of traps on private property, which isn't the case everywhere, but is the case on PEI. This individual who set the traps, which were snares, did not have that permission from this landowner. PEI is also a jurisdiction where you are well within your rights to let your dog roam free on your property, on your private property, regardless of whether it's wildlife habitat or not. And you know, 2 + 2 = 4, and something very unfortunate occurred, and that individual was prosecuted to the extent of the law, charged with trespassing and other things. So this certainly led to a lot of attention on PEI. PEI is not a booming metropolis. Everybody just about knows everybody, and certainly some of the anti-trapping groups from across the country saw an opportunity to weigh in and try and force some action. And certainly a jurisdiction like PEI, which is a very human modified landscape with people just about everywhere. There's no back country on PEI. It's a lot of people in not a whole lot of space, and a lot of that space is agriculture, right?
There is, but it's called the ocean.
Exactly, exactly. So essentially, there was a petition put together that was submitted to the government, and the minister responsible for trapping, Stephen Myers, said, I'm not going to make an emotive decision on this. I'm going to seek expert opinions on this, and we'll take action from there. I'm not just going to make a knee-jerk reaction. And this happened as an election was unfolding on PEI. So, even more reason for someone to make a knee-jerk reaction. But Minister Myers said, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to seek out expert opinion. So he engaged Dr. Pierre-Yves Daou, who's a professor emeritus at University of PEI at the Atlantic Veterinary College. And, Dr. Daou put together a very comprehensive report on trapping on PEI, period. That report was submitted to the minister and now has been tabled in the House or in the Assembly on PEI. And there were some committee hearings with folks from PEI Trappers Association and folks from some of the anti-trapping groups and others. So the elected officials in PEI are certainly listening to feedback and listening to expert opinion. And the minister said, I'm not going to come in with a blanket ban right away on this. I'm going to take time. And he got the report and he said, I'm kind of convinced that this doesn't need to happen the way that anti-trapping groups are saying it needs to happen. It won't surprise me if there are some changes on how trapping is regulated on PEI. In some ways it may be better changes for the better. I don't know exactly what those changes were. Come back to me after those changes see the light of day. I may have a different opinion, but just the fact that a politician, in this case, an MLA, a minister, said, "I'm not going to act on this incredibly emotive issue in an emotive way. I'm going to seek expert opinion and feedback and make a considered decision." The fact that we're 6 months on and I haven't seen a regulatory package come through is encouraging. It means that the department is doing their due diligence and taking the time to consider what changes may be necessary.
Yeah, that was a part of this story that I found super interesting for a politician to say. I want to act on what the evidence says, because my interpretation also was that Minister Myers personally did not like the idea of snares in licensed trapping, and kind of had to separate what I believe is a person versus what my experts and the evidence is saying, and went with the evidence. And whether you're in politics or out of politics, that has got to be one of the most rare things I've seen for the last year, of somebody setting their own personal beliefs aside and saying, what does the evidence say? So pretty cool story.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you say, I'm fairly certain Minister Myers said that in the Assembly. He's like, I have my own opinion on what we should do here, but I'm the minister representing the Crown, representing the people of PEI, and you don't want all of us in these chairs as cabinet ministers just making decisions based on what we think and what we feel. You want us to go out and understand the implications of the decisions we make. So that was certainly encouraging.
Yes, absolutely. So good for licensed trappers on PEI, but it's probably still sounds like there's maybe some things to address a few concerns from the public, especially around the topic of pets that is clear across this nation. So just on that, if you happen to be listening or watching this show and you are not a trapper and this is something that concerns you, because I have actually heard this from from the hunting community in Alberta, that fellows that hunt upland game birds with their dogs get permission to go on private property that a trapper has had permission on. And if somebody has been slow or missed a snare that's been set out, individual's hunting dog is at risk as well as anybody. The Alberta Trappers Association, if you search their YouTube site, I think has a really good instructional video for people out recreating with their dogs and what to do if you encounter one of those unfortunate circumstances. It's very good, teaches you about snares, how to get them off quickly. Spoiler alert, it means actually carrying a set of cable cutting shears with you, and you just quickly snip and set your animal free. So anyways, take a look at that and share that around. It's awesome that the Alberta Trappers Association produced that on such a sensitive issue. It's a proactive move, in my opinion.
For sure, and like you say, for folks that are listening who are dog owners, hunting dog or otherwise, that are in the country or in the wilderness with dogs, you can reach out to your provincial trappers association or your local trappers council and say, hey, I'm in the backcountry with my dog regularly. I want to make sure I understand what it is I need to do. I'm not going to make a promise on behalf of every trapper in the country, but it would not surprise me that if you do that outreach, then that a trapper, somebody local will be able to come and show you how to do it. YouTube videos are great, but having someone who's done it for 30 or 40 years showing you how to do it is even better.
Yep, absolutely. BC, jump over to another kind of touchy issue that started during COVID. So the BC mink farmers were given an order, directive, or a date to shut down in the province, and the industry filed an appeal on that decision. It recently came out of the BC Court of Appeal and was rejected. So as it currently still stands, the ban on mink farmers in the province still exists. That's kind of all I know about it. You know a little bit about this, so maybe.
Absolutely. So this is kind of a tricky one. So there's two court actions that are in play when it comes to the ban on mink farming in BC. One, which is still active, is the challenge led by Canada Mink Breeders Association in partnership with the BC mink farmers to seek a review of the government's decision to phase out mink farming. The other one, which has seen action as of late, is a separate action that was brought on behalf of a group of the individual mink farmers themselves, seeking compensation. That's the piece
Okay.
that was left out of the BC government's original action was, okay, we're saying you can't do this anymore. We're going to buy you out, or we're going to provide compensation. And this is something we see in bans on mink farming around the world, is that there generally is some kind of compensation associated with it. Often it's not nearly enough. The recent proposal to ban mink farming in Lithuania was something like €1 per animal or something crazy like that. So these mink farmers were seeking compensation because these are people that had an active agricultural concern. They have bills to pay. It happened during COVID. They have SEBA loans to pay back and things like that. So they said, regardless of the decision you made or didn't make on phasing out mink farming, we feel that we deserve compensation for the government stepping in and saying your business can't operate anymore. So that's the recent court action that was dismissed by the courts in BC.
Okay.
So shortly thereafter, and there's video floating around out there online. There was a Zoom meeting of the chief public health officers from across the country, the provincial, territorial, and the federal chief public health officer. And BC's chief public health officer, Bonnie Henry, brings up, this call I believe was about avian influenza. So Bonnie Henry brings up, hey guys, also this, court case got thrown out about the mink farms. Watch out, Ontario, you still have mink farms. And she's like giggling as she's saying this, which is pretty gross. These are people that had, it's family farm operations, it's small businesses, and the provincial government, at the stroke of a pen said your industry can't exist anymore. These farmers are just looking for fair compensation to say, okay, if you're going to say we can't be in business anymore, buy us out and we can cover our debts at the very least, and maybe there's enough left over to move into another form of agriculture, or get out of agriculture completely, whatever these individuals choose to do, which I think is like a not unreasonable approach. When we've seen governments take significant actions, the end of the Newfoundland cod fishery, not that that was perfect in its design, but the federal government did take action after the fact, probably not quickly enough, to try and encourage economic development in Outport, Newfoundland, to try and encourage fish harvesters to harvest different species, things like that. We didn't see that from the BC government when it comes to mink farms. They didn't say, okay, we're not going to have a mink industry anymore, but we're going to work with you to transition you into alpaca farming. It was whatever insert farming here.
Too bad, so sad, kind of.
Kind of, yeah. Kind of. This is this sucks for you, but it's not our problem, despite the fact that we're the ones that made you do it. So pretty gross behavior from Bonnie Henry. It's a bit telling that on what she thought was a private conversation, that she was giggling about it. I don't know if someone had cracked a really funny joke right beforehand, but these are the people that we look up to as citizens to make decisions on our behalf. And I would hope that she wouldn't be laughing about anything else on that call in regards to avian influenza. I hope that no one on that call was laughing about the implications for the dairy industry of avian influenza, or the implications for poultry industry about avian influenza. So why is it okay to laugh about the mink industry?
Yeah, exactly. Maybe give your thoughts a little bit for folks. Like, we think of trapping in this country, and people are in the backcountry, they're on snowmobiles, they're harvesting sustainable wild fur, which resonates with people. Say, if you take the issue of salmon, of wild salmon versus a pen raised or farm raised salmon, there's labels. People want to support sustainable ecosystem, and harvesting of that. Why is the fur industry in agriculture an overall important part of fur harvesting as an industry?
So, harvesting of, or I should say, farming of fur, Canada is a world leader when it comes to farming of fur. We were home to the first ever fox farms in the world. They were in just outside Summerside, PEI, of all places. If you find yourself in Summerside, you go to the town museum. There's a whole bunch of stuff about fox farming. Salisbury, New Brunswick claims to be home of the silver fox, which is disputed by the good people of Summerside, PEI. you know, we were home to the first real commercial mink farms. There were attempts to farm mink in the U.S. during the Civil War of all times. It was let's farm mink to make uniforms for the Union Army during the Civil War, keep people warm.
Okay,
And
okay, makes sense. Yeah.
it didn't quite work out. But there were some later attempts shortly thereafter to develop mink farming in Richmond Hill, Ontario, actually. So it's 140, 150 years since that occurred, and you know we brought that technology, we brought that expertise to other parts of the world, and you know we are, I think at last count, we're like the fourth largest producer of mink in the world, and there's a lot of the broader fur industry that likely would not be working in fur if it were not for the availability of ranch mink and fox. It's an agricultural product. You can raise your mink to a given size. You can raise your mink. You can. There's animal husbandry and genetics involved that they can breed for resistance to disease. They can breed for color. They can breed for size. A ranch mink is a very different animal than a wild mink. To the point of we often get into debates about is a ranch mink a wild animal or a domesticated animal. And you look at a ranch mink that's a pastel mink that's kind of purplish, and you're like, that that doesn't look like it would last very long in the wild. And certainly when animal rights activists go and break into farms and release mink onto the landscape, there's probably some of them, a very small percentage, that are able to eke out some survival on the landscape, but the majority of them are going to die. They're going to get hit by cars. They're going to starve. They're just not used to being wild. So you see the same thing with cattle, same thing with horses, same thing with pigs. I mean, probably pigs are even more adaptive. Pigs do a better job surviving on the landscape than a mink does. But that is kind of the reality. Instead of having to find 2,000 fishers that are the same size and the same color and matching them to make coats, you can order 2,000. You can buy a lot of 2,000 mink at Saga Auction House in Helsinki, and you're pretty reasonably certain that those 2,000 mink are going to be exactly the same size, exactly the same color, because they're coming off the same farm.
Okay, okay. So it's not necessarily a threat to wild trapping in the sense that everything could potentially become an agriculture animal, a lynx, a bobcat, coyotes. I would assume it's one of those things that of all of the fur bearers, I know foxes, they can actually domesticate it and turn it into a pet relatively easily, just their nature.
Yep.
Caribou are the same way, of ungulates. That's why they could actually Siberia and stuff actually like have the Sami reindeer herders because they were a easily domesticatable wild animal. So mink probably more so than a marten. But I guess if you are a trapper, would you say this would be fair to say don't view the agriculture side of trapping as a threat to your way of life? It's actually augmenting and helping sustain the market and the furriers that make stuff for your products that go into it. Otherwise, businesses would go out of business and you would have a tough time selling your furs. Like it's a support base for what wild trappers do.
I'd say it's fair to say, in the conversations I have with fur manufacturers and fur retailers, is that mink in particular, and fox to a lesser extent, are a great inlet to fur for manufacturers and for retailers. That it's a way for them to get into fur in a more predictable and manageable manner. And once they're doing mink or doing mink and fox, chinchilla, rabbit, things like that, the other agricultural furs, then they're going to get people coming through the door saying, I really like my mink coat that I bought from you, but do you have anything a bit more unique? Do you have anything that really really shines? that really goes above and beyond. That not, I go to a party with a bunch of other people with fur coats, and there's 50 people, 50 ladies in the room, and 45 of them have mink coats. What can I buy from you that will set me apart? And that's where the conversation gets into sheared beaver, the conversation gets into otter, the conversation gets into fisher, gets into wild fur. And there is price competition at times. Certainly in recent years we've seen when mink is low, when ranch mink prices are low, it provides price competition for things like muskrat and squirrel. Other things that are used primarily for like liners of coats. There is price competition. It's like, well, why would I buy muskrat when I can buy mink for a little bit more? So it's not that there's no impacts whatsoever, but it's certainly not, shouldn't be wild fur versus farm
Okay.
fur.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
really all part of a bigger community. We should be spending time, all of us, fighting against the anti-fur people instead of fighting amongst ourselves, amongst the fur people.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's a super good point. Cool. It's a good update. So just staying in BC, little kind of a tidbit I wanted to update folks on across the country. This winter, British Columbia confirmed the presence of chronic wasting disease for the first time. Those were our first two confirmed positive cases. It's been kind of knocking at our doorstep from south of the border in Montana and Alberta for quite a number of years. So it was two deer. I know both. In fact, one of the deer was a roadkill whitetail deer, probably less than 10 kilometers from where I'm sitting right now, where it came from. They've done some supplemental harvesting in the areas around those two positive cases. The other one was a mule deer taken by a hunter last fall. They have not confirmed any other cases in this geographic area. What they've done out of a precaution measure is they have taken the wildlife management areas where our trap lines and our hunting regulations are attached to, identified the entire management unit where the deer were, and said these are CWD management zones. And there are several of them that kind of like line along the Alberta border and along the Montana border in the southeast corner of BC. So one of the provisions that's now being put on trappers is when we pick up roadkill for bait or bait stations, we cannot take those carcasses to the trap line until we've submitted samples, which is tonsils and lymph nodes. They've been tested and we get confirmation that the deer is not CWD positive, and then the carcass is allowed to be taken out to the trap line. So I was a little bit concerned about that, and I reached out to my local representative of the BC Trappers Association, because one of the issues was with the hunter samples. Like a hunter got a mule deer last October and found out in January that it was positive. Like the backlog of getting stuff through the labs was in the order of like pushing 6 months. So all of a sudden here I'm as a trapper, and it's like I don't want to pick up a roadkill, and then find out next May, and then it's good to go to take it out on the trap line, and then freeze it and store it till the next winter. So apparently the turnaround time they're expecting is to be more in the order of 2 weeks. So okay. Even at that, I would still pick up a roadkill deer. Either the weather would have to be sub-zero and I stored it in my shed until I got the confirmation back, or I would have to break it down and dedicate a freezer for it until I got my confirmation back. So it's a bit tricky, in handling these things, because, basically you pick it up, put it in the back of your truck when you're headed out to the trap line, right? Like it's not very often that, they're just sort of like stick it in the garage and then take it out. So anyways, that's just a bit of an update. It'll be kind of like a condition of our trapping licenses this winter. So it's just another one of those complicated things that, we have to deal with in the world these days. But it's not as bad as it could be, like just an outright ban on using roadkill for bait. So
Yeah, I mean
that's what's happening.
it's one of those things that even I didn't necessarily appreciate very much until coming on board here at the Institute, is how trappers are on the front lines against wildlife disease. And if it's CWD in this case, tularemia, the ongoing march of raccoon rabies further east and north, there's some real mange being probably the one that people would be most familiar with. It's an important part of trapper education to ensure that trappers understand the very real disease risk, both personally and to the broader ecosystem, of dealing with the animals we deal with, and that's both on the bait side and on the target species side. Of as we deal with these things, speaking earlier about avian influenza, talking to sealers about the fact that gray seals are a reservoir population for, I think it's 2 or 3 different strains of avian influenza. That's not something people necessarily think about every day, but you see a news story that comes on, CBC or whatever, says, oh, 300 harbor seals washed up dead on the north shore of the St. Lawrence because of outbreak of avian influenza. If you're harvesting, not that you'd be harvesting those animals, but the gray seals were dying off too in small numbers, you may be harvesting that animal before it would have died of avian influenza, but it's got avian influenza. So as you're handling these animals, you need to be careful, or should be careful. And certainly my trapper ed instructors here in Nova Scotia, when I did my course last year, we spent, I think, 2 hours talking about wildlife disease.
Yep, absolutely. And that's both like this and this, because some of how we as humans can get infected is actually airborne particles that are inhaled. So, yeah, I mean, it's like I said, it's a balance in BC. So it'll make things just a tad more complicated, I believe, for trappers this winter, but it's the reality. If CWD gets worse and pressures on testing increase and they can't keep up with that with opening new labs, it could become more complicated for trappers in the years to come if
For
CWD
sure.
gets out of control, if we lose control of it. So
Yeah.
there was a new study published on Wolverines. It was it was a density study, and so I just thought I would give folks just a bit of an update on some science that's happening on fur bearers in Canada, which I always support. It's cool. We always want to talk about science-based management, so supporting science when it does happen is good. Sometimes we have to be accepting of what peer-reviewed results say, and then address it from there from a conservation lens first, and then trapping lens second. So this study looked at wolverines in the boreal forests. In Canada, there were 2 study sites, one in Ontario, kind of northern central Ontario. The other one was in central Alberta. In Ontario, what they showed is they were finding just slightly under 4 wolverines per 1,000 square kilometers, if you're able to kind of put that into perspective. The leading cause of death for wolverines in the Ontario study was actually incidental trapping catches. Adult survival and subadult survival in the Ontario study area was indicating stable populations. In Alberta, their densities were higher, just slightly under 7 wolverines per 1,000 square kilometers. And adult survival and subadult survival in the Alberta area was actually indicating declining populations. So one of the primary recommendations was that maintaining stable wolverine populations or increasing might be achieved by reducing incidental trapping deaths. If folks are obviously trappers are familiar with wolverines and their ecology. If you're not and you're following us along, they are a very slow reproducing species, kind of like grizzly bears. It can take years and years for a female to replace herself on the landscape. She needs to still be alive when one of her her female offspring reaches breeding age as well. If that's not happening, the population isn't stable or it's decreasing. And so any road kills, accidental, incidental trapping kills in areas where they are closed for conservation concerns or anything else going on is a threat to wolverines. Wolverines, the other thing that kind of adds to their population concerns is their home ranges are so friggin' large. Like they're a male wolverine. If I remember right, like its home range is larger than a grizzly bear. It's starting to rival like wolves in Alaska. Like I mean,
Yeah.
like thousands and thousands of square kilometers that this guy's laying claims to. So if something happens, to that one male in 10,000 square kilometers of a watershed, there can be 3 females that may not get bred, which translates into no population recruitment. So I think, here in BC, wolverines were closed in the southeastern part of the province where I am because of low density concerns. And I'll just say this is how much I admire the knowledge that trappers have and their concern for conservation of species. When they said wolverines are now going to be closed, the following several years, there were no incidental catches.
Yeah.
The biologists heard this through the grapevine, actually thought the trappers were lying. But I'm like, excuse me, I'd like you to take that back because these people are so dialed in that they can make the adjustments that are so species target specific that if they need to catch a wolverine, they know how. If they're told not to catch them, they know how not to catch them.
Yep.
Obviously, things can still happen. I think we've had 1 or 2 incidents in the last, 4 or 5 years, but for a geographic area that big. So the conversation I had with Bill Abercrombie from Alberta, president of the Alberta Trappers Association several years ago, was like, hey, our position is if populations are stable, that's great. We'll trap them. If the science says there's a conservation concern, we'll be the first ones there to say we need to change our practices. We're on board. Conservation comes first. So I really admire them. So anyways, that's kind of what's going on with wolverines, at least in, the southern part, I would say, of the boreal forest region. I think they're much more robust in the northern boreal forest regions. But anyways, this is kind of on the southern fringe of the boreal forests, and there are some conservation concerns for sure.
Yeah, and we certainly, we're starting to see the policy landscape reflect some of these concerns. The Americans just listed wolverine under the Endangered Species Act, which, in conversations with folks in the U.S., they're like, well, how do you know? There weren't many here to begin with. We're already at just about the southern bound to their range, and the densities seem to get thinner and thinner the further south you go, regardless, just by virtue of habitat availability and differences in climate. Every once in a while you see a news story of like, hey, we saw a random wolverine in like California. And I'm like, man, how lost was that wolverine that he ended up in California? But, it is a concern. The federal government is consulting right now. Our federal government is consulting right now on listing wolverine as a species of special concern under the Species at Risk Act. And, that's a long, years-long consultation process. But certainly the Institute has been engaged, and we've been discussing this with some of the provincial trappers associations as well, to say, what is, this listing seems to be mostly, if not entirely, based around climate risk, not around incidental trapping, capture, what have you. But if they were, special concern is kind of like diet species at risk. You know, 0 grams of sugar and 0 grams of management action. It's just, we're going to do some extra science, and often, a little bit distastefully, in my opinion, that's the way that government officials pitch, like, oh, it's good for you to put this on species at risk because we'll be able to free up money for science. Whereas I would just rather us invest in fur-bearer science and have better understanding of all of these species. But it certainly is something that's on the management radar. And as I often say, I have a degree in the most dangerous science, political science, and that's where these conversations end up moving, is they move from biologists and veterinary pathologists and real scientists to the folks in an office tower in Ottawa making decisions about management. So certainly something that we endeavor to do at the Institute, and I know that the provincial associations certainly endeavor to do this as well, is to make sure that the experiences of trappers are actually reflected in what these management decisions that get made. Because, I mean, especially on stuff like Wolverines, stuff like Fishers, no one is dealing with these animals more often than trappers, right? My litmus test of people, is have you ever heard? Oh, we love animals, we love the wilderness, we have to protect it. I'm like, do you know what a fisher is? we need to stop trapping to save the animals. Do you know what a fisher is? It's when I worked.
My grandpa was a fisher.
Well, that used to be my joke when
I have his old rod.
Yeah, in my past life, I'd go to meetings and say, I don't work for the government. And when I was working on fisheries stuff, I was like, I don't work for the government, and I'm not a scientist. And the way you can tell is I don't say the word fisher, because to me, a fisher is a large weasel that lives in the woods.
Yeah.
I will call you fish harvesters, I will call you fishermen, I will call you a whole bunch of other stuff, but I'm not going to call you a fisher, because a fisher is a weasel, and I don't think you guys are weasels.
Yeah, no, that's funny. Yeah, I think another important part, where trappers can play a role here. So these scientific studies that are done, the study areas are generally like very large geographic areas, and they're random sampling across variable landscapes. They are then averaging data like, less than 4 wolverines per 1,000 square kilometers. Now, where I see the disconnect happening is an individual trapper that's working at a smaller scale, say within that, might be like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, it's like, I got way more on my line than what you're saying. Like, what's wrong with your study? So scientific studies look at the chocolate chip cookie dough as this big, huge bowl full of that, right? And they say there's an average of 3 chips per cookie when they're produced. You pick up a cookie and it's got 14 chocolate chip cookies in it, right? And you're like, what's wrong with your estimate? It doesn't mean the science is wrong. The science is a little bit more landscape lens, averaging things out. But that is very, very important for trappers to bring that forward, because in my experience, the scientists and the biologists become super interested if you bring to the table a smaller geographic area, a valley, a corner, a riparian area, or whatever, where the sensitivity of their studies is not picking up on something where it's like, this part of the study area is prime wolverine habitat, and there are a lot more, maybe twice the density that our study showed. You're flagging that for the conservation of that area, because that area is a stronghold for them. You're doing a good job managing your trap line, and that can help the landscape levels. So I guess don't always see that as your boots on the ground experience on your own trap line is meaning the science is wrong. Use this as an opportunity at a finer scale to make scientists and biologists and wildlife managers aware of that. Because it could be a very valuable part of the management over a large geographic area.
Yeah, and those scientists may go, wait a minute, that kind of habitat, that kind of a valley or whatever holds more wolverines than we thought it did. There's 16 other valleys that are exactly the same or largely the same in our study area. That changes our calculus, and they may go and find the trapper that traps in those other valleys and say, okay, our entire density estimate was actually wrong because we weren't accounting for these stronghold areas within the study area, and actually the overall density isn't 6 per 100 square kilometers, it's 16 per 100 square kilometers once we plug in this additional information.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
it certainly is a case of more information is rarely bad.
Yeah. That's,
I won't say it's
that's
never
it.
bad, but it's
Yeah.
rarely
Yeah.
bad.
And that on the ground information,
Yeah.
can feed into what scientists do that they, most of them that I know, find that immensely valuable to
Yeah.
learn, something at a finer scale on the landscape. So this is an interesting story that ties back to the disease part that you mentioned earlier. So, uh, you know, trappers in Canada will augment their businesses, with wild trapping, but also have businesses where they provide wildlife control services in their communities that they live in. They have the equipment, the expertise, the certification to manage problem wildlife in communities or dangerous wildlife in a humane and professional manner. So each city in Canada will usually have some sort of bylaws and policies around wildlife control. The city of Ottawa recently reviewed and made some changes to its wildlife control policy, and this was controversial with the antis. They actually upheld the use of lethal trapping in the city is still one of their control options. That primarily didn't sit well with opponents to trapping for beavers, for managing the city's infrastructure, flood control, those sorts of things. They're still keeping in their policy lethal trapping as being an option. And so I just wanted to touch on that. And, we see the message I want to get across here is we see clear across this country advocates talking about coexistence of wildlife, keep your dogs on a leash and, all of these sorts of things, coexist with wildlife, coexist with wildlife. When it comes to fur bearers, and in particular, the one I'm going to zero in on is coyotes. We're seeing more and more coyotes taking up residence in the urban areas, raising their litters and making that their permanent territories. We see conflicts in Stanley Park in BC and Edmonton, Alberta, places like that. There's still proponents that are saying we need to live with these urban coyotes. There has been a disease that's been picked up in Alberta. It is a tapeworm, a subspecies of, the broader order of tapeworms. They're finding the incident rate of that parasite and other parasites in the urban coyotes is much higher than wild coyotes. When a coyote turns to a diet of more garbage and human food, it affects the microflora in their gut, which is actually making these animals less healthy than their wild counterparts. And so they're more susceptible to diseases. This particular parasite, the tapeworm, can get into humans and end up on our liver, very hard to detect because the symptoms are not really severe, and it can be fatal. And so the idea of coexistence is great, but when we're talking about animals that are stressed, living in a human environment where they shouldn't be, lethal control, in my opinion, is still a viable option for wildlife management in the settled areas of our countries, because we're talking about the health of animals and the risk to human lives. And so kudos to the city of Ottawa for probably upholding expert advice and keeping that as a management option, lethal control.
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to management, it never makes sense to take tools off the table, right? There will be there will be a case for putting in a beaver deceiver or beaver baffler, flow control device in certain cases. In other cases, it will need to be lethal removal and dynamite the dam, depending on what's happening. I've seen both of those occur. Uh, if I was somewhere with a really nice pool full of brook trout above the beaver dam, I'd probably be in favor of someone putting in a beaver deceiver to keep that good brook trout habitat. If that good brook trout habitat happened to be in an intersection, I would be less supportive of putting in a flow control device. Infrastructure protection of infrastructure from beavers and muskrats is a multi-million-dollar business in this country, from the railways and cities and hydro companies, you know, and then moving into the urban space of urban coyotes and urban foxes and things like that. They're
Raccoons.
raccoons. There's disease issues. There's safety issues. I lived in Ottawa until 2.5 years ago. There's coyotes in the arboretum. For folks that are in Ottawa or are familiar with Ottawa, down by Dow's Lake, there's coyotes in the arboretum, and they've attacked people in the arboretum. And the stories of little old ladies getting into their car and getting attacked by coyotes. That's not going to be dissuaded with non-lethal control. I think that there is a necessity for even the you know most most extreme of the antis to say there probably are certain places where there shouldn't be coyotes, and they'll never admit it out loud. But I think in their heart of hearts, if it was their grandmother getting attacked by coyotes, uh, or if they were cycling in the Cape Breton Highlands National Park and getting nipped on by coyotes chasing them down the road as they're cycling, or attacked as that girl in 2009 in the parks, um, that's not far from where I grew up. I'm starting to think that
Mhm.
maybe I'm the problem because it seems as though all these coyote problems are nearby to me. Uh, but there's going to be a need to reduce populations of these animals in certain areas, and there was a time where this control, you know, density across the landscape was controlled by commercial fur trapping, and I would love, as a taxpayer and as a ratepayer for power, I would love to see again a point where the commercial fur market, provides that ecological good and service to the population, paid for by the market as opposed to paid for by my taxes or the price of my food for control of livestock damage and agricultural damage.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's an interesting one because from a, opponents to trapping or wildlife advocates, whatever whatever you want to call it, that are always talking about humane treatment of wildlife, humane, coexistence is humane. When it comes to animals that are living in our cities, in my opinion, it's actually less humane to leave them there because 9 times out of 10 in the incident, there is a risk to people, but 9 times out of 10, it's the wildlife that end up taking the hit. And mostly that ends up with an animal that gets struck by a motor vehicle. So rather than a coyote being removed by a professional trapper, quick bang, it's over. An animal that has impacted health and impacted gut microflora that may not even survive if it was transferred into the wild and had to shift from plastic and garbage to a diet of mice, it may actually end up starving to death because its gut isn't healthy.
Yep.
But rather than a trapper, professional trapper, removing that animal humanely, saying it's an unhealthy animal, we're forcing it to live in an environment that it wasn't meant to be, And now that thing is like dragging its hind end around through the parks in the city and neighborhoods because it got partially crushed by a vehicle. And it takes 3 days before wildlife officials can find it. I'm just sort of, what do we mean when we say humane treatment of animals and it's humane to coexist with them in cities? And, it's not. It's forcing something to live somewhere that's putting it more at risk of an inhumane death and an inhumane fitness and body health level. And human habitat is not always good wildlife habitat. And trappers have an incredible role to play in our most populated places in this country. So,
For sure.
now you got a story on a fashion designer in New York City related to fur and anti-fur
Yeah,
folks.
this is probably the most illuminating part of my job over the last 2 years was having to become very familiar very quickly with the fashion and design world. As a guy who 85% of my wardrobe comes from Eddie Bauer, I'm not exactly the most fashionable person, but this was something that really strikes to the core of what we're talking about with trapping is we can have all the greatest traps in the world. We can have the most humane farms in the world. We can do everything that we can. That, but if no one is buying the product at the end of the day, if there is no commercial fur market left, we become France. We become the Netherlands, where we just pay government contracted trappers to kill animals for the sake of killing animals, and removing them from the landscape. So in New York, I believe it was last week, and certainly New York City being one of the centers of the fashion world, there's been a months long campaign against the designer Marc Jacobs. And so Marc Jacobs is a big deal designer. He's under the Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, the LVMH consortium, and he was getting protested. His stores were getting protested by anti-fur protesters, and not just like peaceful but annoying protesters. It's not just people standing outside the store and saying fur is murder, and they got their signs, and that's, I don't agree with those people. I think those people need a hobby, but that it's we don't want to be in a society where no one can protest things they don't agree with. But this campaign against Marc Jacobs escalated further and further and further, and into damage in his stores and vandalism. And it got to the point that these anti-fur protesters, and I wouldn't even call them protesters at this point, they were following his employees. Like, they'd finish their shift, and the protesters would like follow them to the gym or follow them to their homes. And basically it got to the point where Marc Jacobs came out on Instagram and said, listen, I don't work in fur. I haven't had fur in my collection since 2018. 2 years ago, I did a joint collection with Fendi, which is another fashion brand, and there was recycled fur in it. That's the only time I've worked with fur in the last 5 years. But to satisfy you people that are threatening my staff and damaging my stores, I'm not going to work in fur anymore. And it's not because I have a ethical issue with fur. It's because I want you people to go away. I want
Mm.
you people to leave us alone. I want you people to stop threatening us and committing violence against us. And that's scary. Like, that's the point where this goes beyond a debate. I'm happy for people to debate fur. I'm happy for people to debate plastic. I'm happy for people to debate anything under the sun. That's how we end up with a better society, is through reasoned debate of facts. But when people are being put at physical risk of violence, we are no longer having a debate.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is now coercion. And we've seen it in other stores. Alex Furs in Toronto about a month and a half ago, maybe 2 months ago now, had people come into the stores and they were knocking over displays and stuff. It's if I was someone working, it's retail at the end of the day. You're working in retail as an employee, and people are coming in and threatening me and screaming in my face and telling me I'm a murderer. I'm gonna go work at RW and Company. Like I'm gonna go work at the pretzel stand down the street because it's not. It's one thing to protest Mark Jacobs himself. It's another thing to protest the guy or lady who works in his store for 8 hours a day for probably not the greatest money in the world, right? Just because it's retail at the end of the day. That is the point whereby, and we've seen this at stores in Canada. We saw this with Canada Goose, a very concentrated campaign of private pressure, not public pressure, of private pressure against senior executives at Canada Goose, and figuring out where these people live and figuring out where their kids go to school, and like that's scary because all it takes
Yeah.
is one person who um, is a real true believer in what it is they do, and this turns from smashed windows into a burned down store where maybe they didn't think anyone was in the store, but somebody was in the back, right?
Yep. Yep.
That's where this goes. And I mean, with the exception of the highest up the food chain, the fur manufacturers in Montreal, let's say, they're small businesses. They're family owned businesses in many cases. Same thing with the mink farms. Mink farms that, you know, I know mink farmers that spend their whole day watching their security cameras because they had break-ins at their farm and they live on their farm, and they had someone on their private property in the middle of the night uh, releasing mink from their farms or releasing foxes from their farms. And it's not that big of a jump to go from, okay, we're releasing the mink, to we're going to burn down the barns, to bad things are going to happen to the house and the people in it. The one of the big anti-fur groups in the U.S. right now that's on the more extremist side is called the Final Nail. Right? The imagery there is pretty evocative, and I sincerely hope that it only stays as imagery, because this
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
could get a lot worse before it gets better. We've seen these groups become more and more and more extreme and more underground, and it's not the well-meaning cat lady who lives in Toronto and loves animals who has a legitimate ethical issue with their own personal ethics and morals about fur. It's people that want to see the undoing of the system by any means necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. It in the UK, there's an organization called the Hunt Saboteurs, and they're similar, and they've escalated to the point where, so these are people that got like the black things on their face, balaclavas and whatnot. And years ago, there was a hunt master of an organized hunt was attacked by members of Hunt Saboteur group and beaten with metal pipes. So yeah, this is definitely a concerning trend. I found Mark Jacobs, the fashion designer, on Instagram. Did a follow just before the show. What's something folks can do?
I mean, I think that the best thing that people can do that do support fur and support sustainable use of wildlife is to tell the Mark Jacobses of the world and anybody else you can find that you support the use of fur, and that there is a silent majority out there of folks that do want to see designers working in fur and want to see a fur industry and want to see those benefits come back to the rural and remote communities that rely on fur, whether it's farm fur or wild fur. At the end of the day, if these designers are getting out of fur, at some point they're going to get out of shearling, they're going to get out of down, they're going to get out of whatever other animal animal derived textile because the anti groups are going to move on. If they ever take us out, they're on to the next. You know, Canada Goose
Yeah.
got out of using coyote fur, and the anti groups turned around and said, "Well, you still use down." Same thing happened to Marc Jacobs. The response from PETA was, "Okay, he's out of fur, but he still uses leather." You know, there wasn't even the like good job on getting out of fur and you wait like 2 weeks, give it a minute to come back and then you go again. It was just immediate. You know, there's no actual way to satisfy these people.
Yeah.
And you know, it's one of my daughter's favorite books. I got a 3-year-old, and one of her favorite books is Give a Mouse a Cookie, and that was one of my favorite books when I was her age. And it's we're if we give them the cookie that is fur. I mean, we gave them the cookie that was seals, and then we give them the glass of milk that is fur, and then we give them that is farm fur, and then we give them the straw that is wild fur, and then we give them the what's the next coloring book or the napkin that is shearling, and then we give them the scissors to cut their hair that is leather. It's gonna keep going, and everything that we wear on our backs is going to be synthetic, right? Like that's the end
Yep.
game because
Yep.
even after we get rid of all of these animal derived things, then they'll start talking about monoculture agriculture. And they're going to
Yeah.
say we can't support cotton, we can't support bamboo fiber, we can't support these things. They're monoculture agriculture, and that's destroying the environment.
We can't we, we can't support people like that being around in too many numbers.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think it's a good message, whether it's like if you're Instagram savvy and you want to go find Marc Jacobs and just throw a thing into there saying, "Hey, really sorry this is happening. Just please let your staff know," or whatever, whatever you choose to do with what products you use. I'm a trapper from British Columbia, Canada, and sorry that this is happening to your staff. I support what choices of materials you want to use, and just want to let you know you got some friends out there in the world. And I think to your point, I think we could all do this anywhere in the country, whether it's a small family fur operation, if it like whatever, anybody that's up here, above us that are on the ground, support them, send them a letter, send them a thing, get a few people stop by their store and just say, "Hey, we're trappers, we're sealers," or whatever, and like, "Thanks, just want to meet you, say hello, know that we're behind you," and build those relationships up so that they know the support from the harvesting community is there, and then the rest of the world sees this as well, and it can become a segue for some education. To talk
Yep.
about some of the things that we even talked about on this show with diseases and and whatnot. So, yeah, I think we could step up a little bit, and there's a little bit of an opportunity to start spreading the love a little bit more.
Yeah, that's. I mean, and that's
And
the most powerful tool we have is to vote with our dollar. It's coming up to Father's Day. If you haven't gotten your father his Father's Day gift yet, I guess by the time this comes out, it'll be after Father's Day. But insert next big holiday here. Not every fur product is a $3,000 coat. There's accessories, there's small things, bags, and brooches and all kinds of things. I know some furriers are doing really crossbody bags and cell phone, those like cell phone holder things that the kids wear nowadays on a chain. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to spend a ton of money walking into a fur store. I would love you to walk into a fur store and spend a ton of money, don't get me wrong, but for folks to get started on the escalator of fur, something as simple as buying a sealskin poppy at Remembrance Day instead of $5 into the box at the Legion, buy a sealskin poppy from Always in Vogue in St. John's for $20. All that $20 goes to the Legion anyway. It doesn't have to be 2 weeks worth of pay. And I know times are
Gotcha.
tough for people. It's rough economic times, but for the folks that do still have disposable income, that are still looking to support industries where they can, that's a great way to do it. And go in, take a look around the fur store if you're somewhere that still has local fur stores. Go in, take a look around, see what's there. Just in that way, if you know Christmas is 6 months away, but it's only 6 months away. So might be something in there that it's not a random Friday in June kind of gift, unless your better half is particularly unhappy with you. But maybe it's a birthday gift, maybe it's a Mother's Day gift, maybe it's a Christmas gift.
Yep.
And on
Yep.
top of that, even if you're just in there looking around, you can tell the folks who are there, good job, keep on fighting the good fight. We support you. We're here today. We'll be back again before Christmas. Don't feel discouraged by the fact,
Or
and
alone.
or alone. Exactly. Don't feel alone. There's a lot more people out there that support what it is you're doing than maybe you might think by looking at the number of likes you get on Instagram. Go
Totally.
find their Instagram account, follow them, do some likes, share their posts on Facebook. All of this helps. These small family-owned businesses.
Absolutely. Last story I got, if you happen to be in British Columbia over the next week, particularly next weekend, the BC Trappers Association rendezvous is going to be in 100 Mile House in central BC on June 21st through to the 23rd. I don't know if you can still get tickets. Go on to the BC Trappers Association website, take a look. But if you're in the area and wanted to stop by and mix and mingle a weekend, it's in an old heritage town, camping out and stuff. That's happening 21st through the 23rd of this month. So
Yeah, and
final thing for you.
BCTA folks put on a great time. I was at their AGM here a couple of months
Oh,
ago.
that's right. Yep.
If you go to the rendezvous, tell them I say hi. I unfortunately won't be at the rendezvous. I will be at the Alberta Trappers Association rendezvous, second week, the 12th to the 14th of July in Barrhead. So if you are in the area, if you're at the rendezvous, I'm the big tall guy with the beard. That doesn't narrow it down very much at the Trapper Rendezvous, admittedly. But I'll be giving a presentation on the work that the Institute does. So anyone who's going to be in Barrhead, come by and say hi. So I'm not speaking to an empty room.
Cool. No, it's good. Good to know where you are. Quick update on the June sale.
June sale. So yeah, so as of when we're recording this, the June sale at Fur Harvesters in North Bay is tomorrow. Goes from the 15th to the 17th. Fingers crossed for good prices. There's plenty of fur there. I was just looking at the declared catalog just before this, so there's plenty of fur there. Hopefully, not much fur left after the auction is done, and hopefully high clearances and good prices. We've seen good prices at the mink sales in Europe, so not that there's a direct correlation, but hopefully the fact that there's lots of people buying mink and fox in Europe means there's a whole lot of people buying wild fur in North Bay. So we'll see what comes of that, and then I'm off to the FIC AGM in Corner Brook, Newfoundland from the 19th to the 22nd. So looking forward to seeing folks from all across the FIC world in Corner Brook.
Fantastic. And in the July episode, we'll give you some highlights of the June sale. So cool, man. Good episode. Covered lots of topics.
Yep.
Hopefully, people coast to coast to coast got some value out of this. And
our international listeners. I'll give a shout out to the folks in Finland and the folks in Castoria, Greece, who are listening.
good. Well,
we're going
glad
worldwide.
they are listening. Look us up if you're over here. Give us a shout. Come to one of the Trappers rendezvous. So that's pretty cool.
Yep.
Pretty cool. So good show, man. If you got any comments, drop us a note, and hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Our job is to just fill you in on all types of topics that are of interest to the harvesting community in Canada and worldwide. So thanks, and we'll see you all in the next episode.
Yeah, we'll see you all in July.